Sanibonani, welcome. I'm Debu and this is her story. Thank you so much for taking the time to have another conversation with me on a really important topic, which is sexual violence within religious communities. I'm so grateful, I'm so thankful that we have this opportunity. I'm really sorry it's taken a while. So much was happening, so much life was happening, but by the grace of God, you are here and I am here, and yeah, we're just going to do what we do, and that is really tackle a very silent subject, which is sexual violence against adult women within religious communities. So let's get straight into it. I'm going to try to keep it brief, no promises, but I will try to. Okay, it's a very involved, and it can be a bit of a triggering topic today. We are talking about understanding sexual trauma. So essentially, my intention for today is to dispense knowledge that would kind of help people have greater compassion for people who've experienced this kind of sexual trauma. So I want to give you knowledge that will give you an understanding of the intricacies of what really happens when somebody is sexually violated by a person in religious authority, the kind of experience that they have. Because I think a lot of the venom that people spew out on social media, where they just attack people who come out and say this has happened to me. I think some of it comes from a place of ignorance, some of it comes from not knowing better, some of it comes from our own traumas and we're just projecting it onto other people. Whatever the case may be, but my intention for today is that knowledge would foster greater compassion and understanding. When we know better, we do better. So that's what it's about for me today. I have my notes, so I will be looking down every now and then, so please forgive me for that, but I just want to make sure that I communicate what I want to communicate, and hopefully clearly. Okay, so like I said, we're talking about trauma and sexual violence. Specifically, we're talking about sexual trauma, and this is the kind of sexual trauma that comes when somebody has experienced sexual violence in the hands of somebody who's in a position of religious authority. So it's a triggering one to a certain extent. So please just make sure, if you have experienced something like this, or somebody you know, love and care for has, that you kind of put yourself in a position to have the resources that you would need to deal with this, should it trigger anything within you. And if it does, that's also a pointer that there's some things that are still unresolved that need your attention. Let's get into it. So we are going to be talking about trauma and understanding trauma, but I just want to clarify our understanding of sexual violence, solidify it, okay? So sexual violence is a broad, umbrella, all-encompassing kind of term that describes sexual activity when consent has not been obtained or where it is not freely given. So it's all kinds of activities, sexual activities. So that is penetrative sex, that is anal sex, that is masturbation, that is somebody flashing, showing their private parts, that is somebody forcing you to have sex with somebody, forced abortion, sex trafficking. All of those are sexual activities, okay? But the thing is, sexual violence specifically refers where consent has not been obtained or there is an element of coercion. That means it hasn't been given freely. Okay, so these are the three important elements. There's a sexual activity, there is the lack of consent, and consent specifically, or generally rather, let me say, means voluntary, uncoerced agreement. So if I consent to something, it is out of my own volition. I'm voluntarily agreeing to this thing that I'm consenting to. So in the context of sexual violence or sexual activity, that would mean I am agreeing to engage in a sexual activity without you compelling me to do so, without you forcing me to do so. It's absolutely voluntary. And what we need to understand about consent, which a lot of people, I think it hasn't really clicked, is that consent needs to be continuous. It can be rescinded at any time, and that basically means it can be revoked. I can give you consent as we're starting, it feels nice, it feels good. For whatever reason, at some point, I can decide I don't want this anymore, and I can revoke my consent. And you can't say, when we started, you said yes, so you can't say yes and change your mind. Yes, I can. When it comes to sex, absolutely I can change my mind. Actually, I think in a lot of things in life, we can change our minds. So you need to understand that about consent. And that's why with your partner, with your husband, with your wife, it's really good to check in. Is this still okay? Are you still okay? Can we continue? You know, it might feel a bit tedious, but you can make it romantic. You can do whatever it is, but just make sure that you put yourself in a position where you are absolutely sure, without a doubt, that both of you are in this thing the whole time, in agreement. Because if at any point in time someone no longer wants to, and the activity continues, then somebody has committed a sexual offense. So keep that in mind. It's that serious. Even in marriages, yes, we are married, yes, but I can say no at any time. It's my right to say no. It's your right to say no. So that's consent, and we'll have a whole conversation about it. And then there's the element of coercion. And coercion basically means compelling, making somebody do something, either using force, intimidation, your authority, exploiting their fears. I mean, within the spiritual context, or the context where there is a spiritual authority and a congregant, you know, they even can be exploiting the religious system or the belief. You know, you need to submit to people who are in authority. They could be exploiting scriptures and using that to make you have sex with them, you know, and that doesn't really qualify as consensual sex, because there is that element of coercion. And there's that a lot. There's a lot of manipulation, spiritual manipulation, that happens with sexual violence within this particular context. Okay, so if we need to go into deeper details about sexual violence, so if we need to break it down and say, when somebody says I was sexually assaulted, when somebody says I was molested, when somebody says, you know, somebody committed bestiality, if you want us to kind of break it down and say this is what this means, please let me know. I think that might be a possible conversation that we need to have, so that we're using the right terms to describe our experiences. But for the sake of today, I really just want to focus on the trauma, you know, the psychological, neurobiological impact of this kind of violation. So let's start by understanding what is trauma. So trauma is a response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event, occurrence, situation that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope with it. So trauma is the response that I have when I experience something that I do not have the resources sufficient enough to adequately cope with it. I feel overwhelmed. So think of it as a 5-liter bucket, and somebody's trying to pour in 10 liters of water inside. That bucket is going to be overwhelmed. It will not have the capacity to carry all of that. And that essentially is a very basic kind of idea to kind of think of trauma. And which should also show us that our traumas are different, because what we can handle and our capacities and how we process things are completely different. So your trauma might not be my trauma, and your response to situation A might not be how I respond to situation A. Do you understand? So if for example, there is a predatory pastor and he's engaging in grooming, and perhaps he gets to a point where he gropes you, and that, you know, he touches you somewhere in a private part or something like that, that might be significantly traumatic to someone, maybe who doesn't feel that they can respond and put them in their place. But for somebody else, it might be stressful, it might be unpleasant, but for that somebody else, it could be that they feel they have the resources to say, don't you ever do that again. And that doesn't make one person better than the other. It's just our responses, and that's a product of our experiences, our personalities, our dispositions. It's a whole lot of factors that come into play. Okay, so understand that. Don't expect what you don't think would be traumatic, or what you haven't experienced as traumatic, that I would share the same experience. No. For you, losing a father figure might be, it happens, people die. For me, it could completely change the trajectory of my life, my relationship with male figures, with relationships. It could completely change things for me. Changing a school can be traumatic for a child. For another child, it might not be. It might be an adventure. It might be exciting. It really just depends. Okay, I hope you get that. So let's stop imposing our sense of what a trauma should be on other people. Understand, our traumas are different. Thank you. So what we also need to understand about trauma is that there are different kinds of trauma. Oh, the lights today are a bit hectic. Yeah, so sorry about that. So there are different kinds of trauma. So you have acute trauma, and that's trauma that happens from a single incident. So you might find in this context, you went to see Pastor Prophet preacher, and he tried to come on to you. Perhaps he succeeded and he actually raped you, he violated you sexually. That's acute trauma. It's that one incident, okay? Let's say it happens that one time and that one time alone. It's not an insignificant trauma, but we just classify traumas because even how we would go about dealing with it therapeutically, there are implications on the kind of trauma that the person has experienced. Okay, so our treatment protocol would also align to the kind of trauma that someone has experienced. So there's that acute trauma. There's chronic trauma, and this is repeated or prolonged trauma. So imagine that this person is in a religious context environment, and pastor, prophet, preacher has groomed them, and they get to a point where they are using them as their, sexual, I don't want to use the word slave, but yes, anytime they feel like they want to have sex, they make sure that that's the person they go to. They've groomed them, they've put them in a position that they are not in a place to consent. They've coerced them spiritually, and, he just calls and says, now. I'm coming now, and every time he does it, it's traumatic. So that is that complex trauma. It's prolonged trauma, and we see it a lot in that kind of a situation with religious figures when they have a person or people that it's multiple times over a period of time. We see it in domestic violence. It's the same kind of trauma. It's complex trauma. Chronic trauma, and then there's complex trauma. Complex trauma is exposure to varied, multiple, different kinds of trauma. It's often interpersonal in nature. So it is that trauma that, for example, you grew up. Let's say you lost a father figure, a maternal figure, and that was traumatic. And you were left alone, and that was extremely traumatic. And then you move, for example, into another family environment, and they are physically, emotionally abusive, and that is so traumatic. And then you grow up and you finally find a loving church home environment, and then there's a predator on the pulpit and he sexually violates you. That's another trauma. So it's these traumas upon traumas, and it's different traumas, and it's multiple, and that is complex trauma. And then there's something that we actually also call generational trauma. And if you are of the Christian conviction and you believe, in the spirituality of certain things, you see patterns in people's lives of trauma. So let's talk about sexual violence. You can find, and we find it often, that somebody their great grandmother was, sexually violated by, let's say, their father, and then their grandmother was violated by a neighbor, and then their mother was violated by somebody else, and here they are being violated by a pastor, prophet, preacher, teacher. So it's this trauma that it's generational. It's like it almost runs in your lineage, and obviously there are spiritual implications for that, but we do know that happens as well. So these are the different kinds of traumas that we know about. And what I hope you have understood from this is that trauma overwhelms ordinary responses, okay? So it overwhelms, so I might be able in ordinary situations, and ordinary is personally defined, but I would be able to face certain circumstances and be able to deal with it and be able to, it's stressful, I don't want to have to go through it, but I have the resources to kind of mitigate whatever it is that is happening in that situation. But when it's trauma, I'm overwhelmed. It's more than I can handle at the present time, okay? So what you also need to understand about trauma is that it has a neurobiological impact, and we'll get into that. So it's not about why did this person just decide to do this, or why didn't they do this, why didn't they run, why didn't they do this, why can't they remember? There are things that are happening in somebody's brain during a traumatic event. Certain parts of the brain are activated, neurons fire, there's chemicals that are released in the brain into the body that affect our responses. Because remember, for somebody who's experiencing a traumatic situation, for somebody who's being raped, for example, the mind goes into survival mode. It really literally is life-threatening situation for that person. A lot of people, when they are being sexually violated, they think they're going to die from that experience. They'll tell you, I thought I was going to die. I thought I was going to die. So understand that it really is, it's a big deal. Okay, so I spoke about this a little bit before about common responses to trauma, and I want to get into it a little bit more in some detail. So what we understand about responses to trauma. So here we are, Pastor Prophet has, I lost a father figure, I have a problem, with my husband, and I've gone into this church environment that feels like a home, everybody loves and embraces me, but the pastor starts grooming my environment systematically. He's at a position where I trust him, my defenses are down, he's manipulated scripture, he's introduced the idea that, a man of God can have a thorn in the flesh, and that thorn could possibly be, his need to have sex with multiple women, or he might introduce the concept of a concubine and say, this is spiritual, this is scriptural, and you're serving the man of God if you're a concubine, whatever the point might be, but you are now in a position where he has sexually violated you. So there's been a sexual activity without consent or with coercion. Okay, and so that we're all on the same playing field, let's say he has raped an adult woman. Okay, I came into his office and I thought I was going there for prayer, and that wasn't the case. I got there, he grabbed me, and he decided to do his thing. I'm giving an example. Okay, this is what the common responses may be. Okay, first it would be the fight response. Okay, and that really is about self-preservation. No matter who hurt you, no matter what the consequences on the other person is, your body, your mind goes into survival mode, and it's like, I'm gonna fight this off. So imagine you're going into that person's space where he feels safe, maybe it's his office kind of space, and he pushes you against the wall, and you can see that he's trying, he's unzipping his pants and he's forcing his clothes off of you. Your brain might actually automatically, without you really consciously thinking, am I going to run, am I going to fight? Adrenaline rushes, and you find yourself in a position where you don't even understand where you got the strength. You push him off, you push him off, you kick and you scream. Fight, okay? That's not always physical, by the way. We fight with our words, we fight with our actions, okay? And this is why people who, for example, who use this kind of response, even in their daily life, they are fight kind of people. Those people who are like, you don't mess with them. They are bullies. They are entitled. They'll tell you off. They are harsh. I'm not saying everybody like that. It's because of a trauma. But I'm just saying that fight is not always physical. It's in our interactions as well, okay? And then there is flight. So sometimes when our assessment of the situation or the way that we've processed it is that I'm not going to be able to fight him off. He's too strong physically, maybe even the power that he has outside of this office. It's like, I can't fight the situation, but what I can do perhaps is escape it. And really that's what the flight response is. It's about disengaging and removing yourself from that dangerous situation. So let's go back to the scenario where Pastor Prophet, I'm in his office and he's pushing up against me, and I don't feel like I don't feel capacitated enough to actually fight him off, but because my brain releases these chemicals that I'm so hyper vigilant, I start looking all around, all over the room, and I'm able to notice that there's a window that is open, for example, and I'm able to scramble out and jump out of the window. No, it's an extreme situation, but I'm trying to bring it at a basic kind of level, that's what flight would look like. So it's me trying to escape that danger, outrunning it, basically. And then there's what we call freeze, and that's basically what it is. It's freezing. It's that response where you don't run, you don't fight, you freeze. And it can be a physical freezing. That's where we have something called tonic immobility, where literally the body gets paralyzed during sexual violence, a period of sexual violence. So he could have forced himself in, you started penetrating, and your body just freezes. It's a paralysis where you cannot move, you cannot fight, you just freeze. And that is sometimes a response. It's a traumatic response to the danger, okay? So think of it as maybe you're in a forest somewhere and you see a snake, okay? You think, I can't fight the snake off. I will not be able to outrun it. But maybe if I just stand still, maybe he won't see me. Maybe he will go past, or as I always like to say, it's that thing where, let's say you're crossing a street and the car almost hits you. And in that moment, you don't run. You just stand still, and it's almost like your mind comes back after it's happened, like, oh my God, did I just stand still in the middle of the road? That is a response to trauma. And this one normally comes with something that is significant in our discussion on trauma, and that is dissociation. So dissociation literally is sometimes the traumatic event, the violation is so traumatic, because remember, for a lot of people, this is pastor, prophet, preacher, but he's also dad. You know, he's also father, you know, he's also become someone that you have internalized as a relationship beyond somebody who stands on a pulpit, you know. So imagine, here is pastor, preacher, prophet. He's on top of you. You can see him. He's sweating. He is busy doing his thing there on top of you, with no regard of the fact that you are crying or the fact that you are really in distress, and you are seeing this monster that you used to love or that you love doing, you know, it's this person you love and doing this completely unlovable thing to you. And sometimes that is too traumatic to face, and the brain kind of removes you from that. So your mind removes your attention, your focus from that situation, and you dissociate, and it moves you to something else. You concentrate on something else, you move to another place in your consciousness. And I really like this example. If you've watched this movie I think it's by Tyler Perry, it's called For Colored Girls. There's a woman there who goes on a date with a guy, and they go to her place, they have wine, they dance, you know, and the guy decides to think that that's an invitation for him to have sex with her, and he forces himself on her, he rapes her. And in that moment, all that woman did was to focus on a clock. She completely dissociated. She just looked at the clock. I don't remember if it was digital or analog, but she just focused on that until the whole thing was done. And that is a form of dissociation. So she distracted herself from this situation and she looked onto something else. And that is a response to trauma, and it can get extremely severe. So dissociation is really something we need to get into a greater understanding of, because it has implications for what we remember and what we don't remember. So imagine, pastor, prophet, preacher, teacher is daddy, is on top of you, humping and doing all of these nasties on you, and this is a man you love, you've loved for years, and you've looked up, and part of you still looks up to, because he's a reflection of, you know, God in your life, you know. And your mind takes you to a place where you shut this out and you're somewhere else. And sometimes that somewhere else can create another personality that could be built in response to the situation. So for example, let's say you are this very timid person by nature. Your inclination is just, you've got a quietness about you. And he does this. And while he's doing it, your mind goes into another space and creates a personality that is very fierce, you know, that fights, you know, that is like, you know. And you'll find that people will say, hey, let's say in the future now, maybe you go somewhere and it looks like some guys want to come on to you, and you completely change and you are like, don't mess with me, you know, don't mess with me. You are that person who, you know, maybe you have a gun now or whatever it might be, but there's this fight thing in you. There's this personality that kind of takes over to protect you from similar situations, and it's born out of that trauma. And in the past, we used to call that multiple personality disorder, but now we call it dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative identity disorder. And really, it is that different traumas, so think of complex trauma, can make the mind create different personalities that would be able to, that are a response to that kind of trauma. And it can get so severe that these personalities they fragment so much that they don't even know each other. So you are no longer even in conscious control of which one is activated when. I hope I'll be able to maybe put a pictorial representation of what I'm talking about, but think of a pie chart, you know, and there's this portion of it and another portion of it, and all of these are different personalities within one person, and they are activated by different circumstances, and they were born out of a trauma. So let's say somebody was sexually violated as a child, and at that time they developed a personality of an adult that comes into play whenever they feel like they're in danger. Their purpose, intention, will is to protect them. Okay, the mind creates this other personality thing, and perhaps it's even a male figure. So I can be a woman that has another fragment split in my personality that is male. I want you to think of this now within the context of spirituality, when there are deliverance sessions, and Pastor Prophet, who is delivering somebody? Who are you? Why are you here? I believe in spirits. I believe there's, demonic invasion into people's life, but sometimes those things could be these different personalities that are manifesting. So you have a 15-year-old that is now talking in the voice of this grown man, and he has a name, he has a personality, he has a history. Sometimes that really is personalities that are born out of trauma. Mfundisi, pastor. So you need to be, we need to be knowledgeable about these things, because sometimes we would be trying to deliver people out of psychological traumas. I mean, we'd be delivering people, and it's actually we're just dealing with other personalities. And there are therapies on how to deal with that. And I'm trained in some of those therapies. And, I've been in a situation where literally you would have to bring these different parts. So maybe this person, because of complex trauma, developed a male personality that fights their battles. And maybe out of a sexual violation that happens at a later time, maybe they develop this matriarch that also is there perhaps who's extremely hypervigilant, who's extremely calculative, because they're always looking out for danger. And maybe at some point another trauma made them birth another personality that is extremely timid and extremely non-confrontational and people-pleasing, And they can have all of these things residing within the psyche of one person, and all of those things can have been the result of a traumatic experience. I hope you're following me. I hope you're getting it. It's more complex than what I'm saying, but I'm trying to lay out the basics of it, saying basically what I want you to understand, that you can dissociate during a traumatic event, and that could lead to multiple psychological issues. That really, it's not about somebody laying hands and say out. It's about dealing with the traumas that are at play in that situation. And then the last response. The last response is the fawn response. This one is also a little bit complex. So the fawn response is basically when the victim goes above and beyond trying to make this perpetrator, this toxic person, happy. Okay? So let's go back to the office situation. The lights today are hectic. So let's go back to that office situation. So let's say Pastor Prophet has got you on the wall, he's pinned you down, and he does his thing, and you dissociate in that instance. He does his thing until he's done. And he now has he's got, because they normally don't work alone, hey? There's actually an element of sex trafficking within this whole scenario, because you see that there are enablers normally around him who kind of start, recruiting women for him, and that's, you're involving yourself in something you might not even imagine that this is sex trafficking, by the way. And you might find that he now makes you his go-to concubine, that he goes to, and it's not an agreement, so we are not in an agreement. He's manipulated me, and whenever he wants to do his thing, I'm brought to him, he does his thing, and, uses and abuses and releases you. But the fawn response can make a person who experiences that actually say, you know what, I don't want this to happen, this to ever happen to me again. So what I will do, instead of me being the victim, I know he likes short and light-skinned women who have, a small waist and big hips and big bums, whatever his personal preference might be. I'm gonna make him happy and introduce him to these kind of women, you know. It's her trying to appease him. Actually, it is a trauma response where you now have victims who actually bring other people to this predator because they're trying, if I please him, if I give him what he wants, then he's not going to be after me. It is a response to trauma. It's the fawn response. So there are people who find themselves trapped in this kind of scenario where I don't like it, I don't understand it, but I know if it's not them, it's gonna be me. So let me please him, let me give him what he wants. It's not right. I'm not condoning it, but I'm saying when we know better, we understand better, and we do better. That's it. So I hope what you have gotten from this is that not every victim will physically fight. That's not everybody's response, and don't expect it to be everybody's response. So that means stop saying where are the scars, where are the marks, you know, what did you do, why didn't you run, why didn't you scream? Not everybody's going to do that, and stop expecting that from everybody, because really in a traumatic situation you are in survival mode. It's not even about this thorough linear kind of processing. It's sirens all over, you know. It's understand that, okay? So stop asking people did they fight. Stop expecting them to have fought it off, okay? And what you also need to understand is that memory will be affected, okay? So let's get into understanding of memory. Again, I want you to think about what I just said about dissociation. If I am being raped and I dissociate in that process as my traumatic response of freezing, how much am I going to remember? If I move my consciousness out of this situation somewhere else, I focus my attention on something else, my memory would be fragmented at best. I might only just remember pieces of it. I might not remember the things that you think I should remember. Also, in that instance, the brain's using all of its energy trying to escape, to self-preserve. So your thinking is not the way it would be in a calm kind of situation. And that means one of the ways that trauma would affect memory is that for some people, the brain would release these chemicals that make you super hypervigilant. So you see everything. Your brain, it almost takes a picture of everything. It takes the fine detail. You can even remember the size of his shoes because he took his shoes off. You saw the number, it was 9. You remember the brand. You remember absolutely everything. And that could be basically because your brain went into, you know, overdrive and it became extremely hypervigilant. It wasn't your decision that that's what's going to happen, by the way. It's just how your brain dealt with that situation, and you remember everything, absolutely everything. And when police ask you, you can tell you this and this and this. This was the sequence. He started here, he moved here, he dropped his pants like this, he did this. Okay. But then there are people who forget, especially the ones who dissociate, especially if this is done by somebody who you know and you love. So I don't want to remember daddy, minister, prophet, in this evilness that he had as he was huffing and puffing on top of me. I don't want, because that and what I know and love about him, they just don't go together, and it's too much to resolve. And the brain just takes parts, or even takes that experience and tucks it away in another place of consciousness that you don't deal with on a daily basis. So I can forget, did he have a condom on? And the police are asking, did he put on a condom? I don't know. How long do you think it lasted? How many times did he do it? I can't remember. And people are thinking, like, you can't remember those things. Everybody remembers those things about sex. You remember how many rounds it was. You are telling me this significant traumatic experience, you can't remember those details? Yes, I can't remember because I was traumatized and because I dissociated in that moment, because my brain was trying to protect me from experiencing what I was experiencing. So it diverted my focus and attention. And so I forgot. They can forget. And I forgot my own personal experiences. With my own trauma, I forgot until triggers came very late in my adult life. So people can forget. Just know that. Just know, especially children. But yes, we forget. Or you remember fragments. So you can remember that when I came into the room, I remember that his computer had, the news was playing on his computer. I remember that he turned around and he locked the door, and then he looked at me and he stared at me. I can remember that. And then there are portions that I blur. And then I can't remember what happened after that. I just remember him wiping himself after. And people struggle and they're like, how can you not remember? How come you remember this first part so detailed? And then the main feast, the main part of it is you can't remember. You were concentrating on what was on his computer, but you can't remember this important detail? Yes, absolutely yes. Episodic memory is compromised during this whole event, okay? My ability to remember and encode things in my mind in a sequence so that I would be able to retrieve them in that sequence later on, that is compromised during a traumatic event. So it's normal for people to just remember fragments. It's normal. It happens. Please understand that it happens. These are neurobiological reactions, okay? In your brain, chemicals are released that affect how you process this entire event. Just think about stress. Think about yourself when you're going to write an exam that you studied for, but you get into that exam paper and the first question is that one thing that you don't know, and you panic and you get extremely stressed. That actually normally affects your ability to remember the things you know. And that's just an exam. So think about Daddy, Pastor, Prophet, monster, huffing and puffing on top of you. You wanted prayer, you wanted a father, you were looking for God, and you found a monster. How much of that am I going to remember? How much of that am I going to want to store and keep within my memory? It's a defense mechanism. So please understand that. So that's why also you can have inconsistencies in recall. So you can experience this thing, and in that experience, it's really hot today, guys, forgive me, okay? So you can experience this rape, and after the rape, maybe you run out and there's somebody there, fortunately, and you are able to say, I was just hurt. He just forced himself on me. And that person says, no, let's go to the police. And you need to ask whether that's what the person wants to do in the here and now, by the way. Let's go to the police. And we go to the police. And you get to the police, and the police's modus operandi is that they want to get the information while it's still fresh. And they want to ask, what time is it? What did he do? Okay, and then this, and then what? And then what? And in that time, you haven't fully processed. There's still things you can't remember well, and you give statements in that when you're still in that space, and then 2 sleep cycles later, the memories start to solidify. You start to get a little bit more of the sequence of what happened, and you're like, no, actually, he locked the door afterwards. He made a call afterwards, not before. I was wrong. He didn't call his people before, he called them afterwards. And you start to get these these memories that seem inconsistent with what you said in the beginning, because your memory will be affected, but also this thing of wanting the information immediately sometimes could be that reason, because I'm under pressure. I'm here to say somebody hurt me, and I'm not really clear on the details, but they are expected. So what did you come here to do if you're not going to give us details? And remember, a lot of the time people, the attitude that we meet at police stations is that they're skeptical. It's very rare that you meet somebody who is, I believe you, who takes on that siding with you from the get-go. So it really is complicated, and we need to know that so that we have greater compassion. And some people delay. So with regards to that, actually, research has shown that actually the best information with regards to the experience likely comes 2 sleep cycles after. So it is actually better to get a brief statement as to what happened, allow the person to get 2 sleep cycles, and then allow them to kind of, say what happened. And if you're that person in that time, as things come back to you, you can write them down, record them, and try to piece it together in your mind. Okay. For some people, yes, they can have clarity immediately, because remember I said some people are very hypervigilant in the moment. So it's different for different folks. And really, what I hope you understand from this is that if I delay going to the police, it doesn't mean I'm lying. If I come 10 years later and I say, hey, pastor, preacher, prophet also did this to me. Me too, church too. And you're like, so you're only coming after 10 years? Like, really, I have every right to do that. Thank you. And legally, even in South Africa, the laws have changed now. I think in 1998, the Constitutional Court ruled that they're removing this 20-year statute of limitation. So in the past, you had up until 20 years to report. And after that, hey, it's prescribed like a debt, like you can't report it anymore. But now that has changed. So I can report it 40 years later. If that's when I feel like I'm at a space and a time and I have resources and capacity to report it at that time. Obviously, things around evidence and proving are a bit complicated the later it is, but it still has merit. You're still within your rights to go and report what happened to you, okay? So what I need you to understand about what the victim is experiencing in this moment is that they're fearful. So imagine this has happened. Pastor Prophet has left you there, drenched in his unholy semen, with images of a monster that you used to love, flooding your mind, within a space where you don't know who you can trust with what has happened to you. You part of you doesn't even trust yourself to, you think, no man, maybe I'm not too like, maybe it's me, maybe I invited him, maybe because I didn't say no, I'm at fault. Because remember, there's this grooming and the manipulation of the grooming, so maybe he has convinced you that, you know, this is your service to God, your reasonable act of worship, you know, you are ministering to the servant of God. He's put it in a way that is confusing to you. In that moment, in that time, because remember the effects of the grooming. Maybe, I mean, if we go to the Omodosho case, I mean, he would he would get on his knees and pray with his victim. So let's pray to God to forgive us for what we've done. So already phrasing it like that can make you think that you are complicit because he's saying what we have done. Or you have other people who give their victims money. You know, I've heard of instances where Pastor Prophet, after he's done, he throws money at you. Go take this money for transport, for example. And you're now sitting with the guilt that I took the money for transport, but it was at night. How was I supposed to get home? I didn't know what to do in that moment. It's a lot. And so this person is fearful, and a lot of that fear is enabled by the grooming that has happened before. You fear God because the man of God has said, we're doing this unto the glory of God. You are helping me. This is the thorn in my flesh. God has allowed it. So you fear that if you report, you somehow are going against the program or the plan of God. You fear the man of God because he's, you know, a representation of God. Maybe he's got power, he's got money, he's got influence. You fear him as an individual. You fear you won't be believed because he's a saint amongst people, amongst the community that you're in. And you fear, who's going to believe me? I come from a broken family. I have a history that is stained with A, B, C, and D. Who's going to believe me versus him? So there's fear. And there's also fear because of pleasure. This doesn't happen as often in women. It happens a lot with men, where if they're being sexually assaulted, a biological reaction is that maybe they will get an erection. Maybe they will even ejaculate. And that confuses them because they think, if I got an erection and if I ejaculated, was it rape? Didn't it mean I wanted it? But I didn't want it, but my body responded. And your body can respond physiologically because it's programmed to respond physiologically. But that doesn't mean that you are in it. That doesn't mean that you are consenting. And this causes a lot of confusion with victims, okay? There's shame. Because society has made it our fault. It's the woman's fault. She dressed inappropriately. Where was she going at night? And she wants the pastor. We've always seen that the way she does this and this for him is because she wants him. It's shame. It's shame. Besides, I've been violated. Like, society has created narratives around a woman being sexually violated as something that she needs to feel ashamed for. There's self-blame. Why didn't I run? Because the community, people are asking, but why didn't you run? Why didn't you tell us sooner? Why didn't you scream? Why are you only telling it 5 years later? Why? And there's an element of self-blame, and you also start asking yourself, but why didn't I? But you couldn't. You didn't have the resources at the time to do that. And you couldn't, so you didn't. But then a lot of people blame themselves. There's distrust. So you don't trust anybody again. You don't trust God. You don't trust men of God. You don't trust church people. You form distrust around a place that's supposed to be a place of strength for you. You distrust men. There's just distrust. And imagine living a life where you just don't trust anybody. It's a very difficult life. And I mean, really, who can blame you? Because if you can't trust God to have protected you from this, and if you can't trust Daddy, to have been the person who would protect you from something like this, who can you trust? Yeah. And it's also very difficult to reconcile this dad, this father figure, this prophet, this evangelist, this minister, this representative of God with this gruesome act. It's just a lot for a victim, okay? And also there's the physical consequences. There's STDs. Okay, there's pregnancies. So think about a woman has been violated by her pastor who uses no condom, gets her pregnant. She's a firm believer in, the Bible and its precepts, and she thinks, no, I don't want to have an abortion. She's pregnant with man of God's baby. She has a baby that was born out of a gruesome violation. Her relationship with that child is compromised. It's a lot. So there are these physical in your life consequences every day. It does not stop when your physical scars heal from that altercation. Obviously, there's cognitive and emotional experiences. So you have nightmares, you have intrusive thoughts, you have flashbacks. You have difficulties in your relationships. Some people get very moody. Some people get very harsh. They get suicidal. They get depressed. It's all kinds of things. And I mean, think about the fact that, like I said, let's say somebody dissociated from their experience, and 10 years later, they go somewhere, they meet a nice enough person, and this person's putting on the same perfume that pastor had on when he raped her. She couldn't remember fully what had happened, but that perfume immediately triggers something in her mind, and like a movie reel, things start flashing back, details she couldn't remember, everything just starts coming back, and it overwhelms her. And it's like, I now remember. He did this. Actually, there was an article about this on his computer at the time. She remembers significant things in that time. So imagine now, you thought you had moved on. It's 5-10 years later, and here you are. There's a trigger that takes you back. You work on it, you resolve it. 5 years later, there's something else. There's a dream, there's a nightmare, there's a taste, there's a smell that triggers. It takes you back. That's why I spoke about triggers, because part of the examples I'm giving might trigger someone. Things that seem insignificant, like a smell. Just a smell can take you back. Take you back, and you remember what you couldn't remember before. So you are living always exposed to the potential of these things that could take you back to that experience. And obviously the consequences are also spiritual. Your relationship with God, your questions around God, yeah, they're there. And who are you going to ask, because you no longer trust the people that you would normally ask? So being sexually violated by somebody in a religious position, position of religious authority, is extremely traumatizing. Like I said, research has said if we were to measure it up against other forms of sexual violence, it really is like incest. It's like violation by a family member. And for some women, it's so bad that for them, death is a better option. In South Africa, there was the Uber gang rape case, and the victim in that case had literally just said, you know what, please kill me than rape me. So if somebody can ask for death instead of rape, that should tell you something about the weight of the hurt that is in that situation that someone can ask for death instead. So finally, I want to address this. Why don't they just report it? And why don't they just leave? Why are they still in that church environment? Or why do they still believe in God? Or in that kind of, why are they still in that kind of denomination? Because this happened in that denomination. First, on reporting. So once the trauma has happened, we all have different needs in terms of addressing the trauma, okay? In therapy, we call that a corrective experience. So my corrective experience might not be a corrective experience, okay? There are some people, after the rape has happened, what they need is the perpetrator to admit they did it and to say sorry. For some people, that's what they need. Over and above them being arrested, that's secondary. My primary need, my corrective experience in the here, in the now, is for you to admit you did it, because you keep on looking at me like you didn't do it. You keep on acting like it never happened. And I want you to admit you did it, and I want you to say you're sorry for doing it. So I'm not concerned about the police element of it or the legal element of it in the here and now, because my corrective experience is for you to say you did it and you're sorry. Let's go back to the Omotosho case. This warrior woman called Cheryl Zondi, phenomenal woman. I honor her so much. But if you listen to what she was saying in her testimony, when they kept on hammering at her, and they asked her, why did you go back? Why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? And she said, I wanted him to say he's sorry. I was hoping that he would say he's sorry. I wanted him to admit that he did it and it was wrong. That was what she needed at that time. And perhaps if he does that, at a later time, her need might be different. Okay, even for you, maybe for you, you didn't want to go and report and shout it on the roof. That's not what you needed. Maybe what you needed was to remove yourself from that space and be in a place and space that you think is safe. And that's what you concentrated on doing. And that is fine. So not everybody's immediate need, not everybody's corrective experience is for them to report. Okay, so if 10 years later, older, wiser, my resources, my capacity to handle the trauma that would come with reporting it have grown, that might be my corrective experience. I might still be seeing this guy going on with ministry like nothing happened, seeing young women around him, old women around him, thinking these people are in danger. And maybe in that time, maybe in that season, what I need, my healing, my corrective experience is, okay, he needs to account for what he did. And that might be the time that I feel like, okay, I need to report, and this is the process I need to go through. So you must understand that our corrective experiences for trauma will be completely different. And also, it's a deeply invasive thing that happens, but the need, once you start reporting it, makes it such a public thing. Again, let's go to the Omotosho case. I mean, imagine being asked, did he penetrate you? How many inches? Was his penis touching your vagina at that time? Did this and this happen? Okay, do you remember whether, is he circumcised? Is he not circumcised? Do you understand? You are having to describe intricate, intimate details about yourself in the context of a violation, and that in itself is extremely traumatic. And sometimes we're just not ready for that yet. Sometimes, we're not ready. It's not yet time. And if it's not time, it's not time. If I don't feel that I can handle that just yet, I can't. And I don't want to re-traumatize myself. It's my decision, And besides, okay, I go through this. I describe whether or not he's circumcised or not. I describe that he's got a mark on his inner thigh. I describe that he started to, kiss my left breast, and he then started to do this. In a world that doesn't believe me, in a world that's been programmed and groomed not to believe me, my fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord have become my enemies. Those people who would have been my support system have become my enemies. And it's a lot. It's a lot. So, you know better now. You know better. So see better, do better. It's a lot. People of God, I don't want to lie to you. Dealing with sexual trauma, dealing with sexual trauma in the hands of somebody you know, in the hands of somebody that you loved, in the hands of somebody that you've trusted, is excruciatingly painful. And if we don't report, it doesn't mean we're weak. It might not just yet be our time. And when we do report, we need your support. We need you to say, I believe you. Imagine this person is dealing with so much stuff from this experience. On top of that, they must deal with you going on Twitter, on Facebook, and saying, I'm a liar, I wanted the man of God, where's my proof? Why now? Why not then? I want him. All the nonsense that people do and say. Please do better. Please do better. So I will end it here today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for seeing better, seeing me. Yeah. See you next time.